Okay, Assalamualaikum and a good day class. Because I think for this topic you already learned in biochemistry, so I decided to just record this one and give the summary for each of the slide rather than going on in more detail, right? So for the start, we know that the macronutrient that we take involve protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And eventually, all of these components will actually meet at one point and enter the TCA cycle, and eventually it can produce the energy in electron transport chain, okay, on the membrane of mitochondria. Okay, and we also know that the major energy supplier is carbohydrate, and if we have excess carbohydrate it can be turned into fat. Okay, and protein is the last resort for the energy generation, and the backbone or the carbon structure of the protein can also enter into the energy metabolism pathway. But if we have excess nitrogen, this nitrogen will not be stored in the muscle or tissue and will be excreted in the urea cycle and eventually filtered by kidney and enter into urine. Okay, so basically you guys know what is anabolic and catabolic reaction. Anabolic reaction is the build up, for example, glucose to glycogen, while catabolic reaction is broken down. Okay, for example, glycogen to glucose, and the process of catabolic reaction can produce ATP, while anabolic reaction will use up ATP. Okay, so metabolism takes place within the cell. So basically, the most important organelle in the metabolism is mitochondria, or the battery of the cell. Mitochondria can only do aerobic metabolism, but if the cell doesn't have enough oxygen, it will only do the metabolism in the cytoplasm. And during the process, it can produce byproduct, which is lactic acid that will be transported to the liver and be converted back into glucose in the process we call as Cori cycle. Okay, this one you can refer to the biochemistry lecture. The second important one is, of course, cytosol or cytoplasm, because this is where the site of the anaerobic metabolism will occur, which is the glycolysis only. So if we don't have mitochondria or oxygen, the breakdown of glucose can happen in cytoplasm, for example, in red blood cell. Okay, because red blood cell doesn't have any organelle. Okay, the most important organ in the body for the metabolism is liver. Okay, it can have up to 500 different reactions. Okay, for example, anything that involve toxicant, vitamins, mineral, protein, fat, carbohydrate, and so on, and drugs. Okay, activation, inactivation of drugs. Okay, um, and distribution of the nutrients throughout the body, also cholesterol metabolism, cholesterol formation, ingestion of the lipoprotein, okay, for example, chylomicron, LDL, HDL, IDL, and so on. So this is the first organ to metabolize, store, and distribute nutrients after absorption, involved in specific metabolic processes such as gluconeogenesis that only happens in liver and kidney, bile production that only happens in the liver, and excretion, okay, which is the concept in pharmacology called as ADME, or absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. It also contains cytochrome P450s, the most important enzyme for metabolism of drugs and toxin. So sometimes it can activate the drug, or sometimes it can deactivate the drug. Okay, for example, the paracetamol that we take is only activated in the liver. Okay, or certain toxin, usually it will detoxify the toxin, means that it will try to excrete the toxin out, but in certain cases it can even increase the toxicity of the toxin. Okay, so protein, carbohydrate, and fats are absorbed as amino acid, monosaccharide, cholesterol, and fatty acid. Okay, the monomers. okay, of the macroproteins. The helpers in reaction, okay, this one is pretty straightforward. Enzyme, which is the protein, and also the cofactors. Cofactors can include both vitamin and minerals. Okay, coenzyme is the subset of cofactor. Okay, the helpers in reaction also involve an important part we call as hormone. Okay, hormone regulate anabolic and catabolic reaction. So there will be anabolic hormone and also there will be catabolic hormone. The famous anabolic hormone that we learn also in biochemistry is insulin. Okay, and the famous catabolic hormone is glucagon. So after eating, insulin will uh, act as the helper in stimulating the uptake of glucose into the cell, and then it will stimulate the formation of fat, right? But under the fasting condition, which will happen probably in Ramadan because we don't eat any food. So when we don't have enough glucose in the blood, the glucagon will be released to break the fat into carbohydrate or glucose. Okay, and fat also can be converted to ketone bodies lah. Okay, the glycerol portion will be converted to glucose. Okay, also it can break the glycogen to glucose. Okay, and these two other enzymes, for example, epinephrine or adrenaline is also catabolic hormone that is used during the emergency situation. Cortisol is the stress hormone that is being used under the longer duration. For example, if you are stressed during the exam, this cortisol will be released to break the macronutrient into glucose, okay, to provide the energy that is required during the stress. So the transfer of energy by ATP happens by disassembling the macronutrients and eventually will enter into the mitochondria to form the ATP. So ATP is the high energy molecule composed of adenine, okay, ribose, and phosphate. The breakdown of this phosphate bond can lead to the release of high energy that can be used to power the reaction inside the cell. So if one phosphate is being broken down, we call this one as ADP, okay, adenosine monophosphate. But if we break another one, we can call this one as AMP or adenosine monophosphate. So basically, anaerobic and aerobic metabolism, there are three types. The first phase is aerobic metabolism, one phase, which it will form the acetyl-CoA and enter into the mitochondria. But anaerobic metabolism, there are two phases. One, it will form the lactic acid, usually happens in human and in certain bacteria. And the second one, it can form ethanol, which usually happens in microorganisms. Anaerobic will be slower, but it will form more ATP per glucose molecule. Anaerobic metabolism without oxygen is faster. That's why when we run, we will start using anaerobic metabolism. But it can only produce low amount of ATP, which is about 2, because only glycolysis is being performed. And in addition, you will also incur what we call as oxygen debt, okay, which you need to repay after you finish the exercise or the strenuous activity. Okay, carbohydrates to energy. Carbohydrate metabolism is the backbone of energy production. Okay, glucose is important energy source for the brain and red blood cell. Okay, because red blood cell doesn't have any organelle. It can also generate energy without oxygen and with oxygen. There are four main metabolic pathways: glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate; intermediate reaction pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Okay, this one happens in the mitochondria. The pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. Next, the T6 cycle, and finally the electron transport chain. Okay, so the glycolysis summary, we don't have to go in detail. There are 10 steps. Okay, so basically you will produce 4 molecules of ATP, but only net 2 molecules of ATP because of the investment phase. Next, 2 molecules of pyruvate, which will enter into mitochondria, and then 2 energized coenzyme molecule, which is NADH. 2 hydrogen ions that are transported to the electron transport chain. They actually attach to the coenzyme molecule, and finally 2 water molecule. So for fats to energy, dietary fat yields 6 times more energy. Okay, in the process we call as beta oxidation. Okay, I'm sure you remember how to calculate the ATP from the dietary fat compared to carbohydrate. But we would ask you to calculate the ATP in the nutrition. Okay, the triglyceride basically consists of glycerol backbone and attached to three different fatty acids. So the fatty acid doesn't have to be the same. Okay, for example, the first fatty acid can be stearic acid, the second one can be palmitic acid, and the third one can be oleic acid. Okay, and it is usually stored in adipose tissue. Okay, so for the triglyceride, it will be hydrolyzed to fatty acid and glycerol during lipolysis using lipase. The reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme in the adipose tissue. So glucagon is released during time of fasting and starvation, like I told you before, and epinephrine or cortisol when under stress. The difference is epinephrine is for a short period of stress and cortisol for a longer period of stress. Once in the bloodstream, they will travel to the tissues and enter the metabolic pathway. Okay, so glycerol is glucogenic, which means that it can be transformed to glucose to stabilize the blood glucose level and only represent about 5% of the triglyceride. 95% is the fatty acid. Fatty acid is ketogenic, means that it will be transformed to ketone bodies. Ketones are the backup fuel for brain, means that brain only use ketone after the glucose is not enough. Otherwise, it will always use glucose first. And the function when glucose is limited. So glycerol can usually metabolize in the liver into glucose through a process we call as gluconeogenesis, the formation of glucose, and it will enter glycolysis to produce ATP and pyruvate. The path entered depends on the body needs for the glucose. When the diet is low in carbohydrate, glucose must come from other sources, for example, from the amino acid. So how does protein provide the energy? Okay, so basically protein, the monomer is amino acid. The primary use or the most important function is to building protein. But if you have excess, it can be used for energy production, converted to glucose or converted as fat. It can be used in a limited extent for energy in diets low in kilocalories or carbohydrate. Okay, so amino acid can be divided into two different types. Okay, apart from the essential and non-essential lah, right? It can be divided into ketogenic amino acid, which can be converted into ketone bodies. It can be divided into glucogenic amino acid, which can be converted to glucose, or it can be both ketogenic and glucogenic amino acid. Means that this amino acid can form both ketone bodies and glucose. Amino acid must be deaminated. Okay, means that it must remove the nitrogen portion first before metabolized for energy or used to make fat. Okay, so this deamination will form the ammonia that will be removed in the urine. Okay, so this is the process of deamination. It will produce a keto acid, the portion of the amino acid without the nitrogen. Okay, and keto acid is usually one of the intermediates in TCA cycle and also will produce the ammonia. Given a source of ammonia, the body can make non-essential amino acid from keto acid through transamination reaction. So that's why if we cannot make this kind of amino acid in the body, we need to take it from the diet. So we call that one as essential amino acid. The process of transamination is different from deamination because deamination will remove the nitrogen, but transamination will transfer this nitrogen group to another carbon skeleton and produce a new amino acid. And at the same time, you also produce a new ketone bodies. Okay, this one you also learn it in biochemistry. Yeah. So you can do this practice yourself. Okay, so I will continue this lecture in the next session. Thank you.